At Christmas dinner, my mom smirked. We finally sold Grandpa's house. You were never in the will anyway. My brother laughed. Good, he's just wasting it. I took a sip of wine and said, cool. Hope you enjoy the cash since I'm the one who bought it. The table went silent. I, 32M, sat at my parents' dining table on Christmas Eve, watching my mother arrange her centerpiece for the third time. The crystal glasses caught the candlelight, everything positioned perfectly for the annual performance of family togetherness. My brother sat across from me, already on his second bourbon, scrolling through his phone with that familiar expression of bored entitlement. The ham had just been carved when Mom dropped it. She was smiling, that particular smile she reserved for delivering news she thought would sting. She announced they'd finally sold Grandpa's house. The one on Maple Street, the two-story colonial with the wraparound porch where I'd spent every summer of my childhood. Her voice was bright, almost musical, as she added the kicker. I was never in the will anyway. My brother looked up from his phone and laughed. He said it was good, that I was just wasting it. His words hung there like smoke, acrid and purposeful. I took a sip of my wine, let the moment breathe, then told them I hoped they'd enjoy the cash since I was the one who'd bought it. The silence that followed was profound. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My sister-in-law's eyes went wide. Mom's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, then something harder. She asked me what I meant. I set down my glass and explained. 6 months ago, when the estate lawyers contacted the family about selling Grandpa's property, I'd gone through a shell company to purchase it. The LLC was registered in Delaware, managed through my attorney, completely untraceable to me personally. The sale had closed in October. I'd been the owner for 2 months. My brother's face flushed red. He demanded to know how I could afford that. The house had sold for $470,000. I'd been expecting this question for weeks. I told him I'd done well for myself, that my software consulting business had grown significantly over the past 5 years. What I didn't mention was the brutal hours, the sacrificed weekends, the relationships I'd let wither because I was building something. They'd never asked about my work beyond polite conversation enders. Mom's expression shifted into something uglier. She said this was manipulative, that I'd deceived the family. Her voice had taken on that righteous tone she used when rewriting history to cast herself as the victim. I asked her how it was deceptive to buy a house that was for sale. The estate had listed it publicly. Anyone could have purchased it. I just happened to be the buyer. Dad finally spoke. He wanted to know why. His voice was quiet, genuinely confused in a way that almost made me feel bad. Almost. I told him the truth. Grandpa had raised me more than they had. When Dad was busy building his dental practice and Mom was occupied with her social committees, Grandpa was the one teaching me to fish, helping with homework, showing me how to fix things with my hands. That house wasn't just property to me. It was every summer catching fireflies in mason jars, every winter sledding down the hill in the backyard, every spring planting tomatoes in his garden. It was the one place I'd ever felt unconditionally loved. My brother scoffed. He said Grandpa had been senile at the end, that the old man barely remembered any of our names. The rage that swept through me was white hot. I reminded him that he'd visited exactly twice in Grandpa's last year. I'd been there every week, sometimes twice a week, sitting with him even when he didn't recognize me. I'd held his hand through the confusion, the fear, the gradual dissolution of the man he'd been. My brother had been too busy with his golf league. Mom cut in sharply. She said Grandpa had left the house to her and Dad for a reason, that they were his primary caregivers. This was such a brazen rewriting of history that I actually laughed. I asked her about the nursing home bills I'd paid. $12,000 over 8 months, because they'd complained about the expense cutting into their vacation fund. I asked about the night nurse I'd hired out of pocket so Grandpa could stay in his own home those extra 6 months before the end. I asked about the physical therapy, the medications, the specialty equipment. Dad shifted uncomfortably. He mumbled something about not knowing I'd done all that. Because they'd never asked. They'd been content to let me handle it while they complained about inheritance taxes and real estate markets. My sister-in-law, who'd been silent until now, asked what I planned to do with the house. I'd thought about this question for months. I told them I was going to restore it. Grandpa had let it deteriorate in his final years, too proud to ask for help, too confused to maintain it properly. The porch needed rebuilding, the roof was shot, the plumbing was original to 1952. I was going to bring it back to what it was when I was a kid. then I was going to live in it. Mom's wine glass hit the table harder than necessary. She said I was being spiteful, that I was punishing them for following Grandpa's legal wishes. I pointed out that Grandpa's will had been written in 2008, 5 years before his dementia diagnosis, back when I was still the screw-up nephew who dropped out of college. He'd made them the executors and primary beneficiaries when I was 23 and directionless. He'd never updated it because by the time I'd gotten my life together, he couldn't remember who I was half the time. The will wasn't a reflection of his final wishes. It was a snapshot of a moment 15 years ago, legally binding but emotionally obsolete. My brother stood up abruptly. He said I was a selfish bastard, that Mom and Dad deserved that money. They'd raised us, sacrificed for us, and I was stealing their inheritance over some childhood nostalgia. I stayed seated, kept my voice level. I asked him about the $70,000 Mom and Dad had given him for his business 3 years ago, the sports memorabilia shop that had folded within 18 months. I asked about the down payment they'd covered on his house, the car they'd bought him when he totaled his old one driving drunk. He told me to shut up. I asked him how much they'd contributed to my life after I turned 18. The answer was nothing. I'd paid my own way through community college when I'd finally gone back. I'd built my business from a laptop in a studio apartment while working nights at a warehouse. Every success I'd had was self-funded, self-taught, self-made. Dad said that was unfair, that they'd always been proud of me. I asked him when he'd last asked about my life. Really asked, not just polite dinner conversation. When had either of them shown interest in my work, my relationships, my struggles? I'd been invisible to them unless I was useful. Mom's face had gone pale, then red. She said I was being cruel, dredging up ancient history to justify theft. The theft accusation broke something in me. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd prepared for this exact moment. I'd known this conversation was coming eventually. I showed them the bank statements, the wire transfers, the receipts. Every penny I'd spent on Grandpa's care, documented and dated. The total came to just over $93,000 across 3 years. I told them the house had cost $470. Even split equally among the 3 children as Grandpa had mentioned wanting back when he was still lucid. My third would have been about $157. I was still $64,000 in the hole. The math was ugly and irrefutable. My sister-in-law excused herself to the bathroom. I heard her on the phone in the hallway, probably calling her mother. This was going to be family gossip for years. Mom rallied, shifting tactics. She said money wasn't the point, that family was supposed to work together. I'd gone behind their backs, violated trust, chosen revenge over reconciliation. I asked her what I was reconciling with. They'd made it clear throughout my life that I was the lesser son, the disappointing child who'd needed correction and control rather than support. My brother was the golden child, the successful one even when he was failing. I was the cautionary tale even when I was succeeding. Dad tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn their approval, their attention, their basic respect. I'd watched them pour money and energy into my brother while giving me lectures about responsibility and bootstraps. The one person who'd loved me without conditions was Grandpa, and they'd viewed him as a future payout. My brother said I was playing victim, that I'd always had a chip on my shoulder. I asked him if he remembered my college fund. The one Grandpa had set up, about $25,000 meant for my education. Mom and Dad had borrowed against it when I was 19 for a kitchen renovation, promising to pay it back. They never did. When I'd asked about it at 23, they'd said I'd wasted my opportunity by dropping out and didn't deserve it anyway. Dad's face told me he remembered. He said those were different times, that they'd been struggling financially. They'd been struggling while planning a cruise to Alaska. I'd seen the photos on Facebook. The dinner was ruined, the ham congealing on plates no one was touching. My niece, my brother's daughter who was 9, had been sent to watch TV in the other room when the arguing started. I felt bad about that. She didn't need to witness this implosion. Mom stood up, announced she was done with this conversation. She said if I wanted to be selfish and ungrateful, that was my choice, but I wasn't welcome in her home if I was going to attack her character. I reminded her I was in their home because they'd invited me to Christmas dinner. I'd been prepared to keep the house purchase quiet indefinitely, to let them believe some anonymous buyer had purchased it. She'd brought it up, weaponized it, assumed I'd be hurt by the news. She tried to wound me and hit reinforced concrete. Dad asked if we could please just have a calm conversation. His dentist voice, soothing and reasonable, the one he used on nervous patients. He suggested we were all emotional and should revisit this after the holidays. I told him there was nothing to revisit. The house was mine legally. I'd paid for Grandpa's care out of obligation and love, not as an investment. The only reason I'd bought the property was to preserve the one place that held good memories. They could be angry about it, but that didn't change the reality. My brother called me a spiteful prick. He said I'd orchestrated this whole thing to humiliate them. I'd orchestrated nothing. I'd quietly bought a house. They'd created the drama by assuming I was ignorant and excluded, by mocking me at dinner, by treating me like I was still the screw-up nephew who needed to be reminded of his place. My sister-in-law returned, whispered something to my brother. He nodded, threw his napkin on his plate, and told me I could enjoy my victory alone. They were leaving. I watched them gather their daughter, make their excuses, and head for the door. The little girl waved at me sadly as they left. I waved back, feeling like shit. Mom refused to look at me. She busied herself clearing plates with aggressive clattering, martyrdom in every movement. Dad sat heavily, looking older than his 63 years. He asked quietly if I'd really paid all that for Grandpa's care. I confirmed it. Every bill, every expense, every midnight pharmacy run. I had spreadsheets if he wanted to see them. He was silent for a long moment. Then he asked why I'd never said anything. Because they'd never asked. Because bringing it up felt like begging for acknowledgement. Because I'd done it for Grandpa, not for credit or compensation. But mainly because I'd learned early that asking them for anything resulted in lectures about fiscal responsibility and earning your way. Mom returned from the kitchen, mascara smudged, face tight. She said I'd ruined Christmas, destroyed the family, made everything about me and my grievances. I stood up, told them I was leaving. I thanked them for dinner, meant it sincerely despite everything. The ham had probably been good before it had gone cold. Dad walked me to the door. He said he didn't know what to say, that this was a lot to process. There was something in his expression that might have been regret, or might have been exhaustion at having his comfortable narrative disrupted. I told him I loved them both, that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted to keep the house that meant something to me. That was all this had ever been about. He nodded, but didn't say he loved me back. Old habits. Update 1. The fallout took 3 days to really develop. My brother sent a series of texts ranging from accusations to threats to attempts at guilt tripping. He'd consulted with a lawyer, apparently, trying to find some angle to contest the sale. His attorney had presumably told him what mine had already confirmed. The transaction was airtight, legal, and irreversible. Mom called me on December 27th. She was calmer, more calculated. She wanted to know if I'd accept a partial payment to sign over half the house to them. They'd come up with $100,000, she said, and we could co-own the property. I asked her why I'd pay $470 for a house, spend tens of thousands on restoration, then sell half of it back to them for $100,000. The math didn't math. She said it was about fairness, about Grandpa's wishes, about family healing. I told her Grandpa's wish, expressed to me multiple times before his mind went, was that I'd always have a place that felt like home. He'd worried about me, about my rootlessness, about my tendency to keep everyone at arm's length. He'd made me promise I'd find somewhere to belong. I was honoring that wish the only way I could. She hung up on me. Dad sent an email the next day. It was formal, almost legal in tone. He outlined their position. They felt betrayed, excluded, and financially harmed by my actions. However, they understood the sale was legitimate. They proposed a family meeting in January, mediated by a counselor, to work through the hurt and find a path forward. I appreciated the effort, genuinely. I responded that I'd attend on one condition. They acknowledged their role in our fractured relationship, not just my supposed betrayal. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. We'd been broken long before I bought a house. He never replied to that email. My sister-in-law reached out through Facebook Messenger. She was surprisingly kind, said she understood more than I might think. Her own family had similar dynamics, golden children and scapegoats, love as a transaction rather than a given. She hoped we could find peace somehow. I thanked her, told her I hoped so too. She was collateral damage in this, married into a mess she hadn't created. The house restoration started in early January. I'd hired a contractor Grandpa had trusted years ago, a guy named Pete who'd done the original porch work in the 90s. He walked through the property with me, pointing out structural issues, water damage, electrical problems that needed immediate attention. Standing in Grandpa's bedroom, looking at the water stains on the ceiling, I felt the weight of what I'd taken on. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was months of work, hundreds of decisions, constant presence required. Pete asked if I was planning to live there during renovation. I told him yes. I'd move into the finished basement while we worked on the upper floors. I wanted to be there, to see it transform, to participate in bringing it back. He nodded approval, said Grandpa would have liked that. By late January, I'd moved in. The basement was cramped but functional, and the noise during the day was manageable. I worked remotely, taking client calls in the morning before the hammering started, doing development work in the evenings after the crew left. Living in the house brought back memories I'd forgotten. The specific creak of the third stair. The way morning light hit the kitchen window. The sound of wind in the oak tree outside. Each day uncovered another piece of my childhood, another moment of belonging. I found things during the renovation. A box of my old drawings in the attic, carefully preserved. Letters I'd written to Grandpa from a summer camp I'd hated, which he'd kept in a folder labeled treasure. A growth chart on the inside of a closet door, my height marked in his handwriting from age 5 to 17. Evidence that I'd been loved, deeply and specifically, by at least one person. Update 2. March brought unexpected contact. My brother showed up at the house unannounced on a Saturday morning. Pete and the crew were off for the weekend, and I was spackling drywall in what would become the upstairs bathroom. He stood on the partially rebuilt porch, looking uncomfortable. He said he'd been driving by and saw my truck. I doubted that. The house was 15 minutes out of his way from anywhere he'd normally be. But I invited him in anyway, offered him coffee from the industrial machine I'd set up in the kitchen. We sat at Grandpa's old table, one of the few pieces of furniture I'd kept. He looked around, taking in the work in progress, the stripped walls, the new subflooring visible through open doorways. He said it looked good, that I was doing right by the place. I thanked him, waited for the real reason he'd come. It took him 20 minutes of small talk to get there. His business was struggling, the new sports bar venture he'd sunk money into. He was looking at potentially declaring bankruptcy, losing the house, devastating his family. He'd come to ask if I'd loan him $50,000. The audacity was almost impressive. I asked him why he thought I'd do that after everything that had happened. He said because I was his brother, because family helped family, because he'd do the same for me. I reminded him of the laptop incident when we were younger. I'd saved for 8 months to buy a decent computer for school, and he'd borrowed it without asking and returned it broken. When I'd asked him to pay for repairs, he'd told me I was being dramatic and Mom had sided with him. I'd never seen a dime. He said that was 20 years ago, that he'd been a kid. I listed other incidents. The car he'd borrowed and returned on empty repeatedly. The apartment deposit I'd covered that he'd never paid back. The job reference he'd begged for, which had made me look bad when he'd no-showed his interview. A pattern of taking without reciprocity, of assuming my resources were communal while his were protected. He got defensive, said I was holding grudges, that I'd apparently been keeping score our entire lives. I told him I'd been keeping track of reality. Scorekeeping would imply I'd been tallying points in some competition. This was just remembering who someone had proven themselves to be, repeatedly and consistently. He said he was desperate, that his daughter's stability was at stake. I felt for my niece, truly. But I asked him why his first thought in desperation was me, the brother he'd mocked and dismissed. Why not Mom and Dad, who'd always bailed him out before? Why not his in-laws, his friends, his business partners? He admitted he'd tapped everyone else already. I was the last option. Being someone's last option after a lifetime of being their low priority clarified things wonderfully. I told him no, I wouldn't loan him money. Not out of spite, but because throwing good money after bad helped no one. He needed to face consequences, restructure, learn to live within his means. He called me heartless, said I was bitter and vengeful, that I'd changed into someone he didn't recognize. I told him he'd never really known me to begin with. He'd known the version of me that existed in his narrative, the screw-up younger brother, the cautionary tale, the person he could feel superior to. The actual me had been invisible to him. He left angry, tires spitting gravel on his way out. I went back to spackling, hands shaking slightly, but certain I'd made the right call. Mom called 2 hours later. He'd obviously gone straight to her. She demanded to know how I could refuse to help my brother in his time of need. said this was a new low even for me. I asked her how much she'd given him already. The silence was telling. I told her that enabling him wasn't helping him, that he needed to experience real consequences or he'd never change. She and Dad had created this dynamic by always providing a safety net, teaching him that failure was temporary and someone would always catch him. She said I was punishing him for their parenting mistakes. I was simply not participating in the dysfunction anymore. There was a difference. She said family meant sacrifice, meant putting others first. I asked her when anyone in our family had ever put me first, when my needs, my struggles, my pain had taken precedence over convenience or image or my brother's feelings. She hung up without answering. Update 3. By June, the house was nearly finished. New roof, rebuilt porch, updated electrical and plumbing, restored hardwood floors. Pete's crew had done beautiful work, honoring the original character while making it functional for modern living. I'd furnished it slowly, mixing Grandpa's preserved pieces with new items I'd chosen carefully. The result was a space that felt both nostalgic and fresh, both rooted and forward-looking. Dad visited in July. He called ahead this time, asked if he could see what I'd done with the place. I agreed, curious about his intentions. He walked through slowly, touching door frames, examining the craftsmanship, pausing in each room. In Grandpa's old bedroom, now my guest room, he stood at the window for a long time. He said Grandpa would have loved this, seeing the house restored. I agreed. He turned to me, looking tired. He said he owed me an apology, that he'd been thinking about everything I'd said at Christmas. He'd spent months reviewing his own behavior, his choices, the ways he'd failed me as a father. I waited, skeptical but listening. He said he'd always loved me, but he'd never known how to show it. I'd been so different from him, so independent and self-contained, and he'd mistaken that for not needing him. He'd poured attention into my brother because my brother demanded it, loudly and constantly, while I'd seemed fine on my own. I told him that children shouldn't have to perform neediness to receive love, that my independence had been partially self-protection, learning early that asking for help resulted in disappointment. He acknowledged that, said he saw it now. Too late, maybe, but he saw it. I asked him what he wanted from this conversation. Forgiveness? Absolution? A reset button on 32 years? He said he just wanted me to know he was sorry, that he recognized his failures, and that he hoped someday I might let him try to do better. It wasn't enough, but it was something, more than I'd expected. I told him I appreciated the apology, that I'd need time to process it, but that I was willing to see where things went. He asked if he could visit sometimes, see the house, maybe rebuild some connection. I said yes, with boundaries. I wasn't interested in pretending the past didn't happen or rushing into forced intimacy. But occasional visits, honest conversations, baby steps towards something healthier that I could do. He left looking lighter, or maybe I just wanted to believe he did. Mom never apologized. She sent a card on my birthday in August, generic and signed with both their names, Dad's handwriting. I sent a thank you text, kept it brief. My brother's business did fail. He declared bankruptcy in September, lost the house, moved his family into a rental. My sister-in-law filed for divorce in October. I heard this through family gossip channels, not from him directly. I felt sad about my niece's instability, sent her a card with money for her birthday. Her mother thanked me via email, said they were managing and that my niece remembered me fondly. The house became my sanctuary. I worked from the office Grandpa had used for his accounting business, took morning coffee on the porch he'd built, planted tomatoes in the garden he'd taught me to tend. The restoration had worked, both structurally and spiritually. I'd bought my own inheritance, and in doing so, inherited more than property. I'd claimed agency, established boundaries, defined myself outside their narrative. The cost was family peace, but the alternative would have been losing myself entirely. Some purchases are worth any price. On Christmas Eve, nearly a year after the dinner that had changed everything, I sat on my porch watching snow fall over the yard. Dad had visited earlier, brought me a pie, stayed for coffee. We talked about small things, rebuilding trust in inches. Mom hadn't come. My brother was spending the holidays with his daughter in a different state, trying to piece together a new life. I was alone, but not lonely. The house held me the way Grandpa had, unconditionally and completely. I'd found my place to belong, and no one could ever take that from me again.